Thank you for everybody for having me. It's really a great opportunity for me. I'm going to speak for about 10 or 15 minutes before inviting Justice Page to join me up on stage, and Doug. And what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about the economy, and then we're going to pivot and look at the economic outlook and what are some of the drivers of economic growth. And that's where Justice Page and Doug and I will talk about education and workforce and why that's so important to Minnesota's economic competitiveness. I'd like to start just for a moment and tell you about why I'm here. So why is the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis here? Why is there a Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis? The Federal Reserve is our nation's central bank. Our job basically is to try to manage the ups and downs of the economy so we have an overall stable, growing economy. But there's something unique about our nation's central bank. 100 years ago, actually 1913, Congress said they wanted to spread it out all around the country so that all the different regions of the country are directly represented in our nation's monetary policy making. So they created the Board of Governors in Washington, D.C. You've probably heard of our current chairman, Jerome Powell. Before Jerome Powell was Janet Yellen, Ben Bernanke, Alan Greenspan. They get a lot of press, so you've probably read about them sometimes. They're in Washington. They're appointed by the President of the United States and confirmed by the Senate. But then Congress said, we want to create 12 independent regional Federal Reserve banks that are directly meant to represent these regions. So the Minneapolis Fed is the 9th Federal Reserve Bank, and our region is Minnesota, North and South Dakota, Montana, part of Michigan, and the upper western Wisconsin. Our job literally is to represent all of you. So a lot of my time and my colleagues' time is spent traveling around the region, meeting with businesses, meeting with workers, meeting with local leaders to understand what is happening in our economy. And then I go back to Washington, D.C. every 6 weeks where we set interest rates for the nation. And part of what I'm doing in those 2-day meetings is I'm talking about what's happening here in our economy so that we can make the best decision we can for the country as a whole. Now, we can't set, maybe I should just get behind the podium. We can't set a different interest rate for Minnesota and for California and for New York because it's all the same dollar, so it's the same interest rate for the whole country. But we do want to make sure all the different regions are represented. So thank you to Doug and Molly for having me here today. It's a great opportunity to hear from you. And we're going to turn to Q&A. I'd love to hear from you about how your businesses are going, how your local economy is going, what your outlook is. It'll make me smarter when I go back to Washington in December for the next interest rate meeting. Now, let's just talk about how the economy is doing overall. Well, let me back up for a second. We have something that we talk about a lot. I really hate podiums, so I'm going to try this again because it's like a big barrier between us. We talk a lot at the Federal Reserve about our dual mandate. These are two goals that Congress has given us. One goal is stable prices, what we define as 2% inflation. Think about an economy that's not overheating, but an economy that's not limping along. And maximum employment, which means as many Americans as possible who want to work are able to find jobs and work productively. Now, typically we think these two goals are like a seesaw, trading off each other. So as the economy heats up and businesses, all of you, have to compete to find workers, the unemployment rate goes down, you have to pay more, your wages go up, the labor market tightens, and then that leads to inflation because eventually you have to pass those costs on to your customers. So it's like a seesaw where they're trading each other off. Well, that's how it's supposed to work. The curious thing is over the last basically 10 years from the financial crisis, it hasn't worked that way because we've had slack in the labor market, more Americans coming in that we thought possible. Like the unemployment rate went from 10% in the peak in 2009 to around 3.6% today. Typically, we would think, oh my gosh, we're way beyond maximum employment. But the funny thing happened, while that's been going on, wage growth has been modest and inflation has been low, below our 2%. So there's been no trade-off. This is like, in economics, there's not supposed to be a free lunch. This has been the free lunch because we have not had to trade off these two parts of our goal. So this is really good news for our economy overall. It means that more Americans are working. A lot of people left the labor market because the financial crisis was so traumatic. They lost their jobs, they lost their houses, and slowly, after 10 years, we've been drawing people back in as the job market has gotten tighter, and all of you have had to work harder to find workers. And that's been really good news for the country. The more people we have actively employed, engaged in work, better for them, better for businesses, better for our economy, better for our communities. So that's been going on. It's been a big surprise to us, and it's been really good news. We're happy about it. Now the question is, what does the future hold? And this we don't know. We don't know how many more people out there want to work. You know, when we talk about 3.6% unemployment rate, that number only counts people who are actively looking for a job. If you gave up and you just said there's no job for me out there, you're not counted. Well, it turns out as the job market has gotten stronger, people have said, you know what, maybe I do want to work. Or their brother or sister got a job, or their neighbor or their friend, and they said, you know what, I'm going to go get that job. And as wages have slowly started picking up, we've seen more people come back in. So that's really, really good news for everybody. But again, we don't know how much longer that can continue. I hope it continues a lot longer. I hear from businesses all the time, they can't find workers. And I always say to them, if that's really true, you'll prove it to me by raising wages. And we're not seeing much wage growth. We're seeing a little bit of wage growth, but we're not seeing much wage growth. So I always say this, and it makes me very unpopular, so I apologize in advance, that if you're complaining that you can't find workers, but you're not raising wages, there's a name for that, and it's called whining, okay? And that's the truth. The proof is in wage growth. Now, we are seeing wages picking up now, especially for entry-level workers, low-income folks. Their wages are growing most quickly. And you see it, drive down the highway, you see Target saying $13 an hour, right? The entry-level wages are going up the fastest. I think that's great news because these folks are long overdue for a raise. So I hope it continues. And we're seeing businesses go the extra mile. They're saying, you know what, let's say you have a machine that you want an operator to run. You used to put out a job posting, machine operator with experience on this machine, and you'd have 10 people lined up for it. Now you can't do that. So now businesses are saying, you know what, we'll train you. By the way, it's more expensive for you, I get it, but it's wonderful news for the country and for the economy. You're seeing businesses say, you know what, we don't actually need a bachelor's degree for this job. We can go with an associate's degree or a GED, we'll train you. That's also really good news. You're seeing some businesses say, we don't need to do the drug test for these certain jobs. Or we don't need to do the criminal background check for certain jobs. You're seeing people with fewer skills who are marginally attached, as economists call them, to the labor force, now getting drawn back in because businesses have to. And this is really, really good news, and I hope it continues. Now, in terms of the economy, the outlook, et cetera, right now the US consumer is still strong. So consumption makes up about 70% of our economy. Most people who want to work have jobs, and as I said, their wages are slowly growing. So families have a little more money in their pockets, and they're spending it on food, on clothing, on necessities for their families. That's powering the economy, that's good news. But that tends to be a backward-looking indicator. What about the future? Businesses have cut back in their investment. So we're seeing this regionally, we're seeing this nationally. Businesses are nervous about the future, especially those that are exposed to the global economy. We know Europe is slowed, we know China is slowing, we know about the tariffs and the trade wars. I hear this a lot. Businesses are saying, we're nervous, I'm not sure if I'm going to go hire these additional people. I'm not sure if I'm going to go invest in this new factory. We're just nervous right now. So the forward-looking indicators are a little more nervous. They're a little more cautious because businesses have pulled back in their investment. And hopefully, if there are resolutions in the trade wars and the tariffs, that'll give businesses more confidence. You'll see more investment, and then that can lead to stronger growth in the future. Here in Minnesota, our economy really looks like the national economy. Most major sectors of the U.S. economy are represented here. Ag has been under pressure for many years. Our farmers are very productive. A lot of production tends to lead to low prices. And then when you layer on top of that the tariffs and the trade war, that's another burden that farmers are having to bear, giving them low prices. So that's a challenge. And manufacturers, especially global exporters, are nervous about the future. They're feeling the pressure and the bite of the tariffs. That sector's under pressure. But the consumer-oriented sectors tend to be doing well. Housing continues to do well, has really responded to the rate cuts that the Federal Reserve has done in the last few months. So that's been a boost for housing. So I'd say right now, overall, my base case scenario is continued economic growth. I'm not forecasting a recession, but there are risks on the horizon, the biggest risk being around tariffs and trade and the uncertainty that that creates. Now, let me shift, and then I'm going to invite Alan and Doug up here to join me here in a second. What makes an economy competitive, regionally or nationally, over the long term? Where does economic growth come from? One part of economic growth is productivity growth. So you all in your businesses invent new technologies to do more with less. Or you hire workers that have more skills, so they're more productive. That's productivity. That's really important to long-term improving living standards. The other part of it is simply population growth, right? If you have more population growth, you have more workers to produce things, and you have more consumers to buy things. Well, we're all having fewer kids than prior generations. This is happening all around the world. Advanced economies, fertility rates are falling as people are getting wealthier. That means we're going to have slower growth, all else being equal, because we're going to have fewer consumers and fewer workers to produce things. So what do countries do in response to this? This is just math. One option is you just accept slower growth. You just accept the math. A second option is you try to do what Japan is trying to do, and everyone laughs when I say this. You subsidize fertility, right? You give tax credits to families to have more babies. All right, it is not a winning strategy. Let me just tell you that. It's very hard you need a big tax credit to change somebody's mind about a child, because raising children is expensive. And then second, it takes 20 years to grow a new worker. So it's not a fast solution anyway, even if you could do it. Or third, you can embrace immigration. And immigration has been a huge source of economic strength for America. Japan culturally is very resistant to immigration. We're not perfect at it, but I'll tell you, we're better than basically anybody else. My parents were immigrants. My wife is an immigrant. I think this is an amazing country for immigrants who get to come here and get an education. But another big piece of this is you got to make sure you're not leaving any of your own people behind, right? If you're leaving your own people behind, then you're just shrinking your consumption base, you're shrinking your workforce, and you're putting yourself even deeper in the hole. And so that's why I think education is so vitally important to our future as a region and as a country. I moved to Minnesota 4 years ago. I was very impressed by so much of what I found here. Diverse business climate, businesses that work well with government. I know there are always political frictions, but our government in Minnesota works pretty well. You know, our two sides of the aisle generally get along with each other, which is better than most states can say. And you know, like the partnership between business and the civic leaders, I think is really strong here and pretty unusual. I haven't seen it other places that I've lived. We've got good universities. On average, we have good schools. On average, we have an educated workforce. But if you dig beneath the averages, we have some of the biggest disparities in the country. And it is racial disparities, white versus African American, but it's also economic disparities. If you look all across the state, literally statewide, these disparities exist between low-income Minnesotans and middle-class and wealthier Minnesotans. So that means right now, today, we are leaving Minnesotans behind. And they are your workers of tomorrow, and they are your consumers of tomorrow. And so I've challenged my own staff at the Minneapolis Fed. What could we do about it? How can we tackle this? Minnesota's for 20 years or more has been trying to tackle this, and we have to be honest with each other. We've literally made zero progress, zero, in closing these gaps. And so I reached out to Justice Page about a year ago. As Molly said, Justice Page about 30 years ago created the Page Education Foundation. Education is a passion of his. I was interested in his education expertise. I was also interested in his 22 years as a justice on Minnesota Supreme Court to say, you know, what could we do that could finally make a difference, finally try to break through. And so I'm thrilled that he's joining us here today. So let me ask Justice Page and Doug to come up here. We'll have a conversation, and then we're going to turn it over to all of you.
Great to see everyone this morning. We're going to kick off this part of the program with a quick overview of some of the education items. We'll open it up for questions. Neel, you can stand for anything on the economy. Justice Page, well, there's a lot of things we could talk about with you, sir. It's an honor to have you with us as well. Thank you, Neel, for your comments. This part is about the education and workforce challenges. As I travel the state in my job and meet with our members, meet with local chambers, meet with civic organizations, this is a thing that always comes up. And we can't do something at the Capitol like creating babies, which is a 20-year, what'd you call it? Grow a worker?
Yeah, growing a worker
okay.
for 20 years.
So we're going to not talk about growing workers today. We're going to talk about how we train and attract and retain workers, right? There's going to be a lot of conversation about that today. But part of that is, how do we train them? How is our education system responding? Minnesota has some amazing strengths in the education space. Each of you have in front of you our brand new, hot off the press, business benchmarks report. And you'll see a section in there on workforce. And we have been measuring workforce, our education system for a number of years. We have been advocates for reforms at the Capitol in this space. And you're right, Neel, we've not seen significant improvement. But again, we have an amazing workforce. It's been the envy of the country and the globe for decades. And we have a great preponderance of higher degrees in Minnesota, meaning we have a skilled workforce, a capable workforce, and we have a hardworking workforce. As you look at labor participation rate, we're one of the highest in the country. But there are challenges, as you pointed out. Our achievement gap, our graduation rates are among the lowest in the country. So that brings us today. You did a fantastic report at the Fed. I hope all of you take time to read it. You have a copy of the summary in front of you, as well as the op-ed done by these two gentlemen that I think was very provocative, and it laid out some of the facts, which is what the report lays out as well. So, if you could, just from your perspective, what brings you two together as you think about education, as you think about workforce? Why your two voices? Why now, as we think about the future going forward?
Well, when Neel called, let me back up. I've been interested in education issues and the disparity between particularly African Americans, but really all of our communities of color. The disparities between their performance academically and others. I actually came to the topic looking at disparities between athletes and other students.
Mm-hmm.
And from that sort of beginning, I came to the conclusion that, what we're really talking about is not an athletic problem, but an academic problem. We're simply failing to educate all children at the same level. And so when Neel called and wanted to talk about how we might go forward to actually impact and eliminate some of these disparities, I couldn't resist the opportunity.
And I think we come at this through, we've had different life experiences. Obviously, Justice Page, 22 years on the Supreme Court. When we started talking about this, he looked at it through the lens of what it means for justice and what he saw as a justice. And I look at it through the lens of what it means for our economy. And so we bring different lenses, but they actually complement each other very, very well. And we're both looking at, what can we do? There are 50 states around the country to look at that are trying different things, some having more success than others. In our report that Doug mentioned, we highlighted some other states that have made rapid advances in closing big achievement gaps. And the evidence from that why that's important is these problems are solvable. This can be done. We have not yet done it here, but we shouldn't give up hope. Yes, we have not been successful so far, but let's realize what other states have done, let's learn from them, and then let's see what might make sense for Minnesota.
Share with us some of those things that you learned from your report, Neel, about specific areas of focus that other districts or states have done that maybe we should be looking at here in Minnesota.
A lot of the focus historically has been, well, let's just focus on the school. There's been a lot of focusing on testing, and people debate it. Is there too much focus on testing? Test as a way of measuring school success. I think both Justice Page and I look at testing as an important element of assessing whether or not a student, the individual student, is in fact actually learning. One of the things that our report highlighted is that in Minnesota, some policymakers have pointed to closing graduation gaps. So the difference between white and black graduation gaps, as an example, has shrunk. But if you actually look at college readiness, the gaps have not shrunk, which suggests that we're graduating students that may not be fully prepared to succeed in the workforce. We could graduate everybody tomorrow, and we could say everybody graduates, we're done. But obviously we would not have actually achieved anything. And so I think what the research has shown is that focusing on the individual student to make sure individual students have the teachers they need, the support they need, the resources they need to meet their own needs so that they can graduate with the skills necessary for success. I think that's something that came through loud and clear.
So a decentralized approach to education, flexibility for parents, empowering teachers, what's the mix do you see?
Well, from my vantage point, we best educate children one school at a time, one classroom at a time, one child at a time. And we empower parents, teachers, and students to work together. That's when it really works. And for whatever reason, we haven't been able to bring all three of those together.
I would add another element, which is employers, the business community, into that conversation. We've done that in markets around the state on a statewide basis. And we found success when a student, think junior high, early high school years, find out about a career path in their community. They see a path for their future. They're more mobilized towards it. So that conversation we think is really important.
It's very important. At some level, these disparities are driven by a lack of hope and not seeing a future.
Right.
And I think, as you noted, when a child sort of sees that there's a place for me, or that, well, there's an area of interest that I have that I could actually perform in, good things happen. But for far too many children, they don't have that sense that there is a place for them.
So it starts with hope and a good school.
And a good school.
And an engaged community around them. That's important.
Well, it really does take that collaboration. I see it as a three-legged stool, but maybe it's a four-legged stool. That collaboration between teachers, students, parents, and the business community.
Well, we welcome that conversation. What we witness around the state, as I mentioned, is a eagerness for employers to communicate with educators and the students about creating, as you said, hope.
Well, and that creation of hope, not only is it good for the economy, but it's good for us as a society. It's good for us as a community, because when people have hope, they tend to want to protect and build. When they don't have hope, there's an inclination to want to destroy.
Mm-hmm.
And so, over the last 20 years, our prison population has exploded. And there is a direct correlation between academic achievement and incarceration rates.
Right. And then when an individual is incarcerated, what's the path after their reintroduction back into society? How do we gainfully employ them at a time when we need all workers?
And the fact is that the vast majority of people who do go to, who are incarcerated, end up back in the community, and we have to figure out ways to make sure that they have opportunities to participate in society too. Otherwise, it just becomes a repeating.
Can you take a moment and tell us about your foundation that Neel pointed out you started a number of years ago, focused on education, the Page Education Foundation? Can you give us the origins of that and where it is today?
We, my wife and Diane and I started the foundation back in 1988 with the goal of encouraging, motivating, and assisting young men and women of color in the pursuit of education beyond high school. We do that two ways. One, by providing financial assistance. Grants, I think the grants range in amount from about $1,500 to $2,500 renewable annually.
Mm-hmm.
That's one component. The other component, and I believe the most important component, is that we require our grant recipients, we call them Page Scholars, we require them to go back into the community where they come from, or back into the community where they're going to school, to work with young children, kindergarten through 8th grade, specifically in the area of education. That those younger children can see somebody who looks like them, who comes from their community, maybe has some shared experience, using education as a tool.
Fantastic.
Let me tell you a quick story, which
Yep.
I just shared with Justice Page on Monday. So Justice Page and I are meeting with lots of leaders around the state right now, talking about this issue. And we had a meeting, and then I came back in our bank. We have about 1,000 employees at the Minneapolis Fed. I got in the elevator. There's a tall gentleman, African-American gentleman in the bank, employee of the bank, who's wearing a Minnesota Vikings winter cap. He's about to go outside. And I said, "Oh, are you a Vikings fan?" He said, "Oh my gosh, yes. I'm a passionate Vikings fan my whole life." I said, I happen to be working very closely. I have the honor of working very closely with Justice Page. And he said, "Oh, you're kidding. I'm a Page Scholar. 20 years ago, he got a scholarship." So it's a point, you talked about hope, it's also a point of pride. When somebody gets designated, I am a Page Scholar, he told that to me with great pride, as he should.
Yeah,
So-
I should note one other thing. Our scholars, our goal is to pull people along, not to filter them out. So our scholars are some of the best and brightest. There are also scholars who struggle along the way. They have gone to, over the years, 104 different post-secondary academic institutions across the state of Minnesota.
So they stay many times in Minnesota. That's a requirement?
That's a requirement.
Fantastic.
Minnesota kids going to Minnesota school.
And then you send them back into their communities, that keeps them here. We like that. That's a good thing.
We like it too.
Yeah, we applaud that. Because that's one of the challenges that our faith states, is our demographic reality, right? We're getting older, we're not replacing ourselves. This is the conversation around immigration policy, certainly. But it's also about how do we make sure Minnesota is able to keep and retain our talent. We were bleeding off talent for a number of years. Our net of state-to-state migration was actually in the negative. We've reversed that, we think, hopefully for the long term. But being able to attract and retain and train talent in Minnesota is essential to our long-term economic future, as Neel pointed out in the forecast.
Preparing kids for their future so that they see a future, it benefits everybody. I mean, literally benefits everybody.
Neel, you said that, I'll go back to a question I raised earlier, and if you can go a little deeper for me. Specific cases around the country where we've seen progress or unique approaches to applying education, models that you think are worthy of looking at. You have a few of those that you're putting forth now?
Well, I'll give you one example. One city that's showing some of the most rapid gains in closing the achievement gap is New Orleans. And I'm not saying this is what we would do in Minnesota, but I think it's interesting to look at New Orleans. This is my microphone doing this? Somebody's moving. Doesn't look like it's the three of us. Louisiana had amended their state constitution in the early 2000s to give the state more power over education. And then Katrina hit. And nobody would wish Katrina on anybody. But Katrina effectively wiped out the New Orleans schools and many of their civic institutions because the hurricane was so devastating. And the state then used their new authority to rebuild New Orleans schools. Now, they chose to build it around charters. That's their choice. I'm not here to say charters are the answer or not the answer. But they created new schools. And they brought in place new opportunities and new choices for families. And they're now showing some of the most, the rapid gains that we're not seeing here. Now, again, number one, you don't wish a Katrina on anybody because it was devastating. Number two, you don't want to wait for a natural disaster to be the catalyst for change. So the question is, how do we motivate people to make changes now? One of the things I've learned is everybody says, they're for kids first. Kids first. But let me tell you, it is the adult considerations that get in the way. Whether it's the wallet or power or control. So when you hear people say kids first, you got to test it. Do they really mean it? Oftentimes they don't. Or they mean it in their heart, but when it actually comes out in their head, it doesn't work out that way. So we're exploring how do you really put kids first.
So let's open it up for questions here in a minute. But let me first ask, can I just go back a little bit to some of the comments you made, Neel, about the economy generally and some of the, I would say, uncertainty that exists out there on the horizon. As you look forward, what is the impact, do you think, of the uncertainty that surrounds the trade agenda and its potential impact on states like Minnesota? You mentioned it in a sense of as a business indicator, creating uncertainty. How is that playing out? And I'll respond with what I think needs to get done.
So it's very hard. This is something that is very hard for our economists to calculate. We can calculate if there's a tariff of 10% on so many $1 billion of goods, we can do the math on what does that mean for prices, what does that mean for costs, what does that mean for economic growth. The part that's very difficult for us to model or forecast is if it leads to we call it a shock to psychology. if it leads to a loss of business confidence, your guess is as good as mine, is how people react to that and how much they pull back. You know, if everybody gets scared, for whatever reason, everybody gets scared at the same time and everybody pulls back at the same time, that itself can cause a recession. And so we call this, in economic terms, it's a nonlinearity. Things don't just move slowly, they don't move gradually, all of a sudden they spike. And that's what's very hard for us to forecast. So we are seeing the tariffs themselves, the dollar value percentage on the dollars of goods, that's not that big a deal. But it's the fact that it's hitting confidence, hitting psychology, that's what's causing businesses to pull back. And I really don't know. Is
Right.
it going to be a modest pullback and we're going to recover now? Or is it going to lead to some broader slowdown? I just don't know.
Yeah, and our comments have been, nobody wants a full-blown, protracted, multi-year trade war. But we do hope that there's something on the horizon that produces a good trade agreement. So like the USMCA with Canada and Mexico, two very important trading partners for Minnesota's economy. Those are really important. And if we could do something in the China space as well, that's very positive. So if there's an outlook or an end game here, we hope that it's a good, very positive trade agreement for Minnesota. We know from our Grow Minnesota data, which is a program that we do on our economic development program about business retention, we go out and do about 1,000 visits a year. We know from those businesses that are involved in trade, particularly for exports, they historically do better economically as far as growth is concerned for that business here in Minnesota. So we're for good trade agreements that help Minnesota's economy go forward, and we hope that we can see more of that in the coming years, sooner the better.
Agreed. No, look, I'm all for, we need to get to fair trade with China. That's the destination that we need to get to. The trick is, how do you get there? And, we'll see.
Let's open it up for questions. We have one mic, which is going to run around the room. Lauren's got it. Questions for Justice Page or President Kashkari? Joe.
This is for Neel. You mentioned in your opening comments that the current unemployment rate here in Minnesota is 3.6. However, that does not reflect the people who are not actually looking for a job. My question is, what are these people living off of? And is there any way to incentivize them to get back into the labor force?
Yeah, and by the way, the 3.6 number was a national number, but the number's not far off from that for Minnesota. It's a good question. You have some people who are on disability, and you're seeing some signs now. The economists used to say, once somebody went on disability, they're gone. They're on disability forever. We're seeing some evidence that people are now exiting disability and re-entering the workforce as wages are slowly picking up. They're living off of their spouse or their family members, et cetera, or maybe they're just doing a few odd jobs here and there, but not in the formal labor sector. So we just don't know how many more folks are out there. It's a remarkable thing. So the government has economists that do these surveys every month to come up with this unemployment rate, and they call thousands of people, and they ask you a question, do you have a job? No. Are you looking for a job? No. Many of those same people who this month said, I'm not looking for a job, next month will take a job. It's not supposed to work that way. You're supposed to go from, I'm not looking for a job, to, I am looking for a job, to, I have a job. So there's a lot of uncertainty underneath these numbers. And my bottom line is, until I see wage growth pick up, I know we're not really at full or maximum employment. That's going to be my proof. So let's let this continue.
Can I follow up, Neel? You said earlier about wage growth, you just did not picking up as fast as maybe you prefer.
Yep.
But I would ask you, though, does wage growth include cost of benefits or benefit growth?
It does. So we have many different measures of wages and compensation, some that are just literally wages, some that capture all forms of compensation. Across all those measures, we're basically seeing the same trend. It has picked up somewhat, but it has not picked up to levels that would imply a big inflationary spike to come in the future.
Molly.
Hi. So Justice Page, this is a question for you. You said that hope is a big educational barrier for successful outcomes. I'm wondering, at what age can you instill hope? At what age is it necessary to start instilling hope? And how, as a business community, can we engage with the kids so that we can let them know that there is a career path if they follow through with their education?
Well, I think it begins as early as possible. And as for what you can do is, you know, I physically spend time in schools talking to kids about their hopes and dreams and how they can achieve them. Each one of you has that power, and you never know what you might say, what you might do that will influence a child in a way that creates that spark. And so I would encourage all of you, go visit a school. Go visit, spend time with children. I understand you're all busy and have responsibilities and all that, but you would be surprised the impact that you can have simply by having direct contact. And that's over and above whatever, you know, sort of broad-based contact as a group you might have.
Other questions? Back here.
Everyone. I'm one of these guys that likes looking for solutions, and sometimes I'm pretty rudimentary in terms of if I got a little problem, or if I hear something that's interesting, I like to pick up on it. And so, happened to be listening to a podcast the other day, a company out west that I normally listen to, they have stuff on leadership and stuff, but they had a guest that talked about a program called the Other Side Academy. Has anybody ever heard of that? Basically what it is, you take people that are incarcerated and you put them into a program that's self-sustaining, and ultimately they basically generate their own revenues, they sustain the program, and they rehabilitate people to ultimately join the workforce. And what was stunning to me is there was a guy that was making the presentation about this, and he was talking about three different people. He showed three different people, you know, criminals and stuff, tattoos and drugged out and everything else, gave their stories, and at the end of it he said, and I happen to be the first guy I just showed you. And this guy was very well spoken, very professional, and I guess all I'm saying is might be fun to check this out, because to me that struck me as here's a micro solution that might be feasible for different regions of the country. I think they're trying to spread it around, but it just hit me as being a real positive type program.
Give us the name of that program again.
Called Other Side Academy.
Okay.
An example of that, and I'm blanking on the name, but at 41st and Minnehaha in Minneapolis, there is a small restaurant, and I for the life of me, I can't think of the name.
All square?
All Square. That is a perfect example of that, where they have people who have been incarcerated, they've started a business, and quite frankly, it's the best grilled cheese in town.
We're headed there next, after our luncheon.
When will the tariffs end?
Your guess is as good as mine. No idea.
Hi, thank you very much for your information this morning. It's been helpful. I have two questions. One is, why do you think that we are graduating more students who are not prepared for college? And two, what can we do to reverse that trend, and how can we help?
You want to start?
I'll let you start, but you know, your question caused me to pause and think. You know, if you look at the numbers, if you look at the numbers of those both graduating, but also those who are underperforming, it's shocking. It is shocking. Actually, when I look at the numbers who are succeeding, and that number seems low to me. But I'll let you.
Well, I think, I mean, one simple answer is, unfortunately, if you turn up the heat, people respond. And so there have been examples. So this is one of the criticisms. I'll give you an example of testing. There have been examples around the country where people really turned up the heat on testing and teachers cheated. And they filled out the test for the students and they showed remarkable results until they figured out that the students weren't actually learning. And then the teachers got caught. I think I'm not trying to say that something quite that nefarious here, but if you turn up the heat, well, we can close graduation gaps, but they haven't learned. And so that's why we're very focused on how do we make sure that each individual child is in fact learning the skills that they need. And we're not sitting here saying every child needs to go to a 4-year college.
Right.
We're saying kids need the skills necessary to participate in the economy and in our democracy. And that may be a 4-year college for many kids, it may be a 2-year college, but it's at least graduating.
Yeah, I mean, that's the sort of the theory underlying what we do at the Page Foundation. Our kids go to community colleges, vocational technical schools, you name it. They're at the University of Minnesota, they're at St. Olaf's, they're at Carleton. They span the whole range. But every child, every person has the ability to contribute both to our economy and to our democracy. And at the end of the day, what we're really talking about is ensuring a just society for everybody, so that everybody gets to participate to the extent that they, or their contribution to that society is to the extent of their abilities and their desires.
And let me just go back to what you were saying, in that the awareness for the individual to know about the opportunity after school, right? Moving forward, creating a path for them to get through school, to graduate, and then that there's an opportunity waiting for them. And that awareness is part of that hope we talked about earlier.
One of the things we're doing with the Page Foundation is we've now developed relationships with several companies in the metro area, developing internship programs, developing programs that give our scholars the opportunity to see what a company is like, what opportunities they may be there in real concrete ways.
And that's a beauty of some of these flexible programs, and the apprenticeship programs too, which are a very important part of that process. Academy programs that we're seeing spring up around the state, where students are being prepared for work. They get the certificates upon graduation and they go right into the workforce locally, and that's really important. That creates that pathway, that pipeline that the business community is working on. The challenge that we see, though, is that students many times come out of school and they don't have the right skills. The business community has been filling that gap, being very innovative in this space to create an environment that they can be trained up and hopefully stay with that business. So they're putting resources into that component to make sure that they have the right skills, soft skills, technical skills, so that they can move into the workforce.
And as a monetary policy person, I'm thrilled to hear that. Historically, monetary policy, central bankers said, these gaps are not our domain. Our domain is the whole economy as a whole. These gaps need to be addressed by Congress and local leaders in fiscal policy, targeted training programs as an example. My view on this is now reversed in the last few years, because all of you, and this is not a criticism, businesses do things that are in their long-term economic interest. It's now in your interest to train workers. It's now in your interest to give people the chance that otherwise you didn't need to give a chance. So what I realized is, because the overall economy is strong, and I think monetary policy has played a role in keeping the expansion going, having the labor market be tight, it's now creating all of these benefits to society in all of you doing now what's in your own interest to do. Because usually when Congress rolls out a new training program and it gets studied, they're very marginally effective, generally speaking. There's not a lot of success in these federal mandates training programs. But now we're seeing thousands of businesses across the country doing very targeted things that are in their own interest, in their own communities, and you're having great success doing it. So I've actually concluded that monetary policy has a very important role to play in creating an economic environment where you all can carry it forward.
and that requires dedicated resources.
It does.
Morning. Morning. The changes you're talking about, you cited New Orleans. It came out of crisis. Transformation comes out of crisis quite frequently. The incremental changes you're speaking about, they're great, but how do we transform the education system? That's really what we're talking about. We can't wait 20 years, or the baby option, maybe that's not a bad option. I disagree, but how do you transform? And are you looking at transforming?
We are, and I think generally what we're talking about is changing the focus from the system to the child, so that we ensure that every child, as opposed to every system, every child is given the tools to perform.
I couldn't have said it any better than you said it. So, and I think we totally agree. We have to treat, this is a crisis. This is a crisis today, and we have to acknowledge that it's a crisis today, and we can't wait 20 years. And so, stay tuned. We are talking transformation.
And this will be our final question.
So I'm in the design and consulting business, so we, civil engineering primarily, and we do a lot of construction-related work. And our industry is white, and very white. And most of our industry has continued to wait for the colleges to produce engineers. We've decided to do a training program that we're calling Opportunity Plus that will go into the communities of color and train people for our lower-end jobs that they don't have to have a college education for. And my comment to you is that as I've researched this, and we're rolling it out in January, but I'm constantly being told why it can't be done and why it shouldn't be done and why it's very risky for me because I might say something wrong or offend communities of color with what I am doing. And so there is an attitude out there, even from people who should be promoting it, to say, you can't do it, or it's been tried and somebody else failed at that. And so I think there is a little bit of that out there right now that in some ways it's risky, right, to take it on, because if you don't do it right, then people criticize you. But I agree with you, it's about hope, and I think it's about showing these communities that there is an opportunity in our industry to do something. But maybe part of what you need to be communicating to all the business leaders out there is that it's going to take a little courage, and all of these other people that are telling you can't do it, you just have to stop listening to that, or at least get them to get on board.
Well, how many people, when you started your businesses, were told you can't do it, you're not going to succeed? Right?
As a Supreme Court justice, we would hire law clerks every year, new ones. And our clerks were primarily white. And when challenged, the response was, well, we can't find qualified clerks of color. And interestingly, I managed to find one or two every year. We only hired one or two every year, and I seemed to be able to find one or two that, and I say one or two only because I was only looking for one or two every year. And the concern was that if you, depending on your standards, how would they perform? Well, I dare say the clerks that I hired performed as well, if not better, than anybody else's. And
Cheers to
so
that.
you simply have to, at some point, take the step.
Okay. Please join me in thanking Justice Page
Thank you.
and Neel Kashkari. Thank you very much.